Senator Singh.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I rise today to speak on this matter of public interest. How we function as a just society is fundamental to our Australian democracy. How we support those that are socially vulnerable demonstrates the integrity of our policies. The coalition government's budget policies contain, however, no trace, none of this integrity. This budget is not a real solution for all Australians. It is not even a partial solution to a phony economic crisis. It is not a solution at all. It is a plan of cuts, a plan that rips up the Australian social contract, a plan that takes up a reactionary axe and hacks apart piece by piece Australia's commitment to give each of us a fair go, the fair go way of life that we know so well in Australia that is now currently under threat. And those Australians, most Australians, without power, privilege or prosperity are being brutalised. New taxes are being imposed, pensions are being cut and vital services are being slashed. This budget has made the coalition government's position very clear, and that is they don't like people. They know that their budget hurts people, they know that it doesn't need to, and they don't care. This 2014 budget is ideology masquerading as serious financial policy, but this disguise has fooled no one. It is callous, it is a callous attack on our most vulnerable Australian citizens. And these are Australian citizens who do not have the luxury of simply tightening their belts, citizens on the margins, fellow citizens of ours who will inevitably become lost in an underfunded services system, causing irreparable damage to their long-term health, well-being, education and productivity. These Australian citizens have been writing to me and calling me ever since this callous Abbott government budget was announced. And their appeals are simple, their complaints are justified, and their fear is real. And I want to share with the Senate some of the words of these Australian citizens. The Abbott government was elected on a series of lies and has an agenda that was not presented to the people of Australia prior to the election. It is a budget which will cause long-lasting and profound damages to our society and our nation as a whole. Changes to the university fee payments and HECS are frightening. I want my children to go to university, or at least to feel confident that they can if they choose to go. This is in jeopardy now. My son, who has no voice, but I do, and I'm writing to you to consider carefully this blatant attempt of forcing low-income families into poverty and hunger. We need a society that helps one another, not condemn those that need the help the most. Well, I think those comments from some of the Australian citizens that have written to me, and I'm sure there are many that the coalition senators have had sent to them as well, say a lot about how the Australian community fear and regard this Abbott government budget. If it was hidden in easy promises, vacant slogans and unity tickets before the election, it is crystal clear that this government now has utterly embraced an empty neoliberal cliche when it comes to incentivising on the rich and the poor to contribute to our country. Deep in their bones, entwined in their DNA, this right-wing government is convinced that Australians and rich Australians and big corporate members of the Australian community deserve tax cuts and superannuation works, while the rest of Australia, on medium and low incomes, are served with increased taxes, reduced services and gutted superannuation contributions. This budget is the archetypal Conservative blueprint for maintaining the status quo increasing wealth and prosperity to those who have plenty already, and concentrating power and influence with the powerful and the influential, and turbocharging social inequality in this country. One clear example: the previous Labor government put in place a significant reform package that addressed loopholes in the tax system which allowed multinational profit shifting. Those Labor reforms were to close that loophole, and they were working until now. Although they've paid lip service to the gathering global momentum on multinational profit shifting at the G20, this government does not mean what it says, as always. And as always, they ignore the words, the slogans and the promises and look to the actions of the coalition. As always, their actions will tell a different tale to their words and their slogans. According to my friend and colleague Dr. Andrew Leigh, this government's only action on multinational profit shifting has been to reverse a cumulative $1.1 billion in multinational profit shifting restriction measures announced by Labor. So in the middle of a confected budget emergency, the government has given up on $1.1 billion. $1.1 billion that has to come from somewhere else or from someone else. And this hard right government has been very clear about who that someone else will be. Worse services for people with less money. In fact, make those worse services even more expensive, if not cut them entirely, and make sure that those Australians on lower incomes pay more tax, get a smaller pension and less superannuation. That is simply not fair. So not many people win out of this Abbott government budget, but at least for the coalition, the right people win. The winners are the same members of our community who are already being looked after with those corporate tax cuts. Big corporate companies send their profits offshore, paying millions of dollars for a paperclip in Ireland, and then, for their financial sins, pay less corporate tax on what profits they couldn't shift here in Australia. $1.1 billion that could be added to the tax revenue base in this country and invested in our healthcare system, in our education system, in our welfare system. An elderly man who is struggling to get through the rest of his life, now on reduced superannuation, to live with dignity and some measure of health and happiness, will now, of course, under the Coalition's budget, pay more to see his doctor and also operate out of a reduced age pension. But that is, of course, not until he can access the aged pension. If a man at the age of 69 worked all his life, body's giving up, worked in hard labour-intensive work, needs to access a Centrelink aged pension, he will not be entitled to one under this budget because of their lifting of the aged pension age. A young woman with a child who is literally unable to earn or learn in the short term because of her circumstances, what will she do? She won't be helped with the revenue from the hundreds of millions already shifted offshore by major multinationals, that $1.1 billion. She and the hundreds of thousands of Australians working or learning or striving to make something of themselves will be sold out short by this cruel Abbott government budget. So to Australians like the elderly man or the young woman, to Australians like most of us here, the opportunity cost of reversing Labor's tax revenue measures is writ large in the brutal attacks on our Medicare, on our pensions, and increases to fees in higher education. Even services like legal aid, a fundamental, if not forgotten, government program that provides all Australians with some measure of access to and opportunity within our legal system, that access to justice. Services like these are cut, while the door is opened, of course, as I said, for tax revenue to flow offshore. I also note with despair, but not surprise, that the government is using this budget to attack the environment from all sides. While with one hand they compromise in their by now familiar manner every promise they made before the election to protect the environment by ripping millions, billions out of their environmental policies, with the other they are laying down the red carpet for big polluters to cut and gouge profits out of Australia's national assets by neutering effective legal and community opposition. The government promised to spend $2.55 billion on its so-called emissions reduction fund, part of direct action, over the next 4 years before the election. $2.55 billion in that ERF fund. But it is only budgeted, surprise, surprise, $1.15 billion, less than half, showing its tokenistic policy there at heart. The government promised to keep the Australian Renewable Energy Agency. They promised repeatedly to keep it before the election. So obviously after the election, they are doing their best, of course, to get rid of it. Also under the government's gun are the Low Emissions Technology Demonstration Fund, the National Low Emission Coal Initiative, the Energy Efficient Programs, the National Solar Schools Program, Energy Efficiency Information Grants, and Low Carbon Communities. And then to complete a pincer movement on the environmental Hannibal would be proud of, as efforts to improve the environment are underfunded or deleted, the government goes for the advocates and the environmental NGOs, undermining the former and removing the tax charity status of the latter. Now that this government has clarified its position that a sustainable and healthy environment is in fact an obstacle to their progress, not the best hope for our future, it is launching its final offensive on the remaining thin green lines of protection for the environment, the last lines of protection left. Even though the Productivity Commission has found that funding is warranted for the Environmental Defenders Offices, given, as, and I quote, given the public interest element of many environmental disputes, this government is removing support for them and the important work that those EDOs do. They also want to prevent concerned Australian citizens from getting a modicum of tax relief from donations they might make to organisations with missions to protect national assets that they may love. So this budget seeks to fabricate a very different Australia to the one we know and love, not an Australia that we all want to be a part of. It is cruel, it is heartless, and it is hurtful. An Australia that is void of any policy integrity is what this budget lays out. A winner-takes-everything Australia for which they have no mandate. They were voted in on what they said, and what they said was worthless. It is a deceptive, ideological, anti-government, anti-Australian budget that is the direct result of the government's empty campaign at the last election. As an opposition, they had no policies, only promises, and now as a government, with their promises in the ashes, they've got nothing, and we do know it. The Australian people know it. They know that this budget is cruel. They know that it is heartless. They know that it rips up the Australian way of a fair go for all, and they do not support that kind of Australia.